All right, so this one is going to be about XDS on FHIR. Hopefully you saw the previous ones, you kind of got a feel that IHE is doing stuff. This one's going to be very much a drill down into XDS. Is there a question? Okay. So I am John Moehrke. I'm with Bylight. I work with the VA, previously with GE Healthcare. And I'm also co-chair, as this shows, of the IHE ITI Planning Committee. I'm also co-chair with NHL7 of the security work group and part of the core FHIR team and a bunch of other babbly books. So what I'm going to go through today in this segment is, given that document sharing exists, and I'll give you a very, like 2-3 slides deck on what is document sharing and what do I mean by that. But given that document sharing exists, how can I use FHIR to gain access to this wealth of information? That's essentially the story for this particular segment. So I'm going to talk about accessing generally the metadata. What are these documents? How do I get a hold of the document in its original form? How do I decompose that original form into something more FHIR friendly? And then if I'm using the more FHIR friendly way to get access to the allergies, and I need to use that allergy in a report of my own, how do I give proper reference back to where that allergy has originally been recorded? So I need the provenance back to the original document. So this will be a good wrap up of a whole environment and the like. So a health information exchange in the view of IHE is a document sharing environment. Basically, in the middle, you have patient identity management, and you have this document registry. A document registry holds metadata about documents that have been published. Around the inner circle there are these document repositories. Document repositories hold the documents that are described in the document registry. And essentially, this is a health information exchange that many different participants can play in. So that's the participants around the outside. So this isn't really intended to be an explanation of XDS. It's intended to just set the table that these environments exist. And IHE has an alternative to this, which is the cross-community access, which basically says if I have multiple of those things on the previous page, and I need to be able to access documents that might exist in multiples, how do I do that? How do I federate many health information exchanges? And the XCA in this case even supports where an EHR will publish itself as if it was a health information exchange. And many of the EHRs like Epic or the VA act as an endpoint in an XCA environment. They don't really have inherently XDS inside, but they can look as if they have XDS inside. So that's what XCA is. So again, this is a predominantly, these documents exist, and they're out there. Boy, you can't really see that, can you? I didn't notice that on the previous. Well, yeah, no, I really do have to reduce. Oh, I see what you're saying.
I don't know if this has anything to do.
Well, I don't want to play around with this. I'll just read it for you. So documents have principles, and if you've ever been involved in CDA, these principles will look very obvious to you, but they're very important for what I'm going to be explaining, because a document, by its definition here in healthcare, has these characteristics. It has a persistence. So The document continues to exist in an unaltered state forever. So persistence means that you know it will always exist that way. Doesn't mean that it doesn't go through revisions, but revisions would have their own persistence, right? It has stewardship. A document has someone who has declared they're going to be the owner of that. Okay, so stewardship is the characteristic that says, you know, this document is going to be maintained by someone who is going to declare that they are the custodian. A document has the potential to be proven authentic. Okay, if I just have a fire allergy sitting out in the middle of nowhere, I really can't prove that it's authentic. I probably trust it because it came from someone who I trust, but you know, it doesn't stand on its own as authentic. A document contains the context under which this document is describing. Again, if I just hold a fire allergy, and this is not to say that a fire allergy is a bad thing, I don't know the context of that allergy unless it's fully described in there in some narrative way. A document as a whole has a context. A document has wholeness. So it has a start, a begin, an end, and it has a story within it and such. And then documents have a characteristic of human readable, which means that it doesn't take special technology to make them readable by a human. In many cases, you know, there are style sheets. There's many style sheets for CDA. Doesn't mean that you can just open a CDA in a notepad and read it, but the human readability means that without special technology, a style sheet, I can display it. Now, FHIR resources have that in theory as well. They have the text element. So a FHIR resource has some of these, but not all of these. That's going to come back later on as why that was important. Within XDS and XCA, there's also this concept that this environment is context agnostic. It means you can put a CDA document into XDS, but you can also put other documents in there. You can put a DICOM document. You can put some of the older forms of CDA in there. You can even put CCR in there if you know what CCR is. And indeed, you can put FHIR documents into XDS, which might come back in the later piece here. There are also some special document types, on-demand document types, which I can create a brand new document for you of this kind. Usually it's a medical summary based on my current information. That would be an on-demand. A delayed assembly is one where I have an episode of care that happened 20 years ago, but nobody's ever asked me for the document. I could create it for you if you want it. That's what delayed is for. So within the context of XDS, it can handle any of these. And indeed, it can handle all of them holding the exact same content. And you're starting to see some of this. Here's an example on the right where imagine a consolidated CDA 2.1 is published into XDS, and a transform of that is available in CCDA 1.1, a C32, a PDF, and maybe a FHIR document. So you can have transforms also within XDS. It's kind of a useful thing, and we'll come back. So what is XDS metadata? It's a bunch of elements that help you use, discover, search, sort documents. It's metadata about the document. Various reasons why you would use it. All of this kind of stuff is well documented within IHE, but a bunch of different reasons why you would need metadata. So that is, you know, document sharing exists, 101. So we now have document sharing. There's a bunch of these that are nationwide environments in the US, in various other countries, in Canada, in Europe. So MHD is the profile from IHE. I just talked a little bit about it last time. That's intended to give a FHIR API into that document sharing environment. You can make a document sharing environment with just MHD, but its intention is to be as an API into an existing document sharing environment. So it works best that way. MHD is intended to allow you via FHIR APIs, so the JSON, RESTful HTTP GETs, to do simple queries, get back a list of document references, be able to look at that metadata, you know, what you just saw on the previous page. It's of the same metadata. And then ultimately pull the document. Question? Does it cover the... MHD does. Yes, MHD does. I'm not covering it here because this is predominantly on the consuming side, but yes, MHD has a publication side as well. So you create a bundle, has a document manifest, has one or more document references and binaries for the document itself. Yep. Yeah. Well, you'll see on the next slide, I kind of tear down this use case, but essentially the use case that drives MHD is it's an app that's willing to understand CDA, probably because it has a style sheet to display it, but it doesn't want to deal with EBXML SOAP transactions. So predominantly, no, I don't have it on the next page, but predominantly the big benefit of using MHD is that you get to do HTTP RESTful GETs to get at the metadata rather than SOAP-based transactions and using EBXML registry specification. Yeah, HTTP REST. Last on the page, anybody in the US, the Argonaut project is enhancing US core, and they're now adding document reference. The document reference is out for public comment right now. They're writing that to be compatible with MHD, but due to issues with organizations, they're creating, their own structure definition. But this specification from US Core is compatible with MHD, and it actually explicitly says that. So the inside of this diagram is XDS. You were asking about, publication side. Yes, there's a publication side in MHD. But predominantly, I'm going to continue on with the consumption side on the right-hand side. So essentially, it's intended predominantly to be an API for XDS, not to be, itself an infrastructure. But it could be. This is the XCA diagram with the highlighted section is where MHD tacks onto XCA. So again, it can be an edge API to these kinds of things. There's some other support profiles that I talked about in the previous hour, PDQM, PIXM for patient lookup. None of this stuff is too complex. Actually, I do discuss the provide All right. I really need to get that to fit the screen, don't I? I apologize. I'm going to go through the machinations of trying to get this to fit the screen better. Oh, they are? Okay. Well, then I'll just go back to presenting. Oh, why didn't that come up? Oh, okay. So in MHD, there is the publication side. So imagine an application that is, again, willing to create some kind of CDA, willing to create a PDF, willing to create a text document. So MHD is document agnostic. It's not specifically CDA. In this case, how does it publish them to a FHIR, using a FHIR API? And essentially, it creates a bundle transaction in create mode, has one document manifest, has one or more document references. With each document references is a binary. The binary is the document itself. So if it's a CDA document, you base 64 the CDA into this binary resource. And then you describe the document, the metadata in the document reference, and you can publish it. We do use list for the equivalent of an XDS folder. And then in the bundle, you might include the patient, or you might include the patient by reference. Some of the other factors that get involved in MHD, because MHD is intended to be an API to XDS, and it has many of the constraints around XDS, you'll notice that the author element and the source patient info element are required by MHD to be contained resources. As contained resources, that means that they will be only livable within that document reference resource, which is very similar to what happens in XDS. The patient source info element doesn't change in XDS, even if you merge patients and fix the patient. The source info was the source info at the time it was published. So it's a rather similar concept to be contained. But that's one of the specifics in MHD. In this environment, not really critical to the next piece, but you can imagine I can use this to just simply push a set of documents to a recipient. So it doesn't even have to be anything other than a push transaction. So maybe using a direct HISP, this could be an API to kick off a secure message. The receiving side is made up of a document responder and a consumer. Document consumer is a typical actor name here. This is intended to, you already know what the patient resource is. So you've either used PDQM or PIXM or just a query to the patient resource to get what is the patient resource. So you have to have a patient resource in your query. And then there's a set of other parameters. Generally, you're going to be querying on class, practice setting, the time frames. There are others that are defined in MHD. Again, it's a subset of those all that are defined in FHIR. But generally speaking, you have a set of query parameters for document reference. You have a set of queries for the document manifest. In this environment, one of the other factors involved is that the document consumer is the one that initiates the transactions, and the document responder is the one who's responding. The arrows here in the case of are showing the data movement. If the document responder only asks for document references, never asks for document manifests, it's still a compliant system, right? It only asks, it only needs those. If a document responder doesn't have any document manifests, it just returns none found. So very low bar to be, to be a document responder. All you have to do is respond to the query parameters that you were given with what you have. Any questions on the fundamentals of MHD? Yes? This one? So this is the publication side. So I'm some kind of a mobile app and I want to publish a document. Could be a FHIR document, could be a text document, could be a CDA. But essentially I'm going to just create a bundle with a manifest. The manifest explains why am I publishing. That's the predominant purpose of a manifest. The document reference is just the facts about the document, not about the transaction, not about why am I publishing this. So that's why there's a separation of those two. Another question? Oh.
You mentioned
Yeah, you could. Essentially, one of the APIs to a HISP is XDR, right? Well, this is XDR right here. And really a HISP, oops, I went the wrong way. A HISP would be a nice document responder too. Yeah. Now, I don't know of anybody who's doing that, but clearly they complain about, SOAP, so here's REST. Yeah. Yeah. The binaries. So we use the binary resource within FHIR to hold the document bits itself. So inside a binary, it's really a very small resource, but it has a big blob. Yeah. So I'm publishing, in this case, 2 different documents. So I have the metadata for each document. This is not actually contained. I just did it I indented it to show there's a relationship there. So yeah, that's one submission with 2 document references, 2 documents, and a folder.
So that's when you start a CDA or something like that?
Correct. Yeah, so the binary would be a CDA, could be a FHIR document, could be a text file. Yeah.
Doesn't have to be a binary, right?
It has to be a binary in this bundle. Correct. Correct, yeah. So here, to the point is, I don't have these labeled, but imagine this is a query on document manifest. This is a query on document reference. This third one is the retrieve of the document bits itself, which essentially is a FHIR request on a URL. It's just a get on a URL, which the magic of a binary resource in FHIR is that the responder gets to look at the HTTP negotiate. And based on the HTTP negotiate, it can say, oh, hey, this guy understands CDA XML. So I don't have to base 64 of the result. I can send him back the XML. Now, magic bonus points, if you want to go off and do this, there's nothing to forbid in the MHD case this responder from saying, I looked at the HTTP negotiate and he says he'd like a FHIR document. He'd prefer one. And I've got the transforms. I just saw it over in one of these other sessions on how to transform a CCDA into FHIR. This happens to be a CCDA. Why not just transform it for him and return him back a FHIR bundle? You can do that. Now, it's not part of the MHD specification. I kind of tried to write it in there, but I was told, no, don't do that, please, yet. maybe we'll do that in a future generation, but there's no reason why a document responder can't be smart and say, hey, he has that he'd like a FHIR JSON. I can convert this to FHIR JSON. Okay, so it's possible. I don't know if that was where you were heading, but it set me up good. Any other questions on MHD, the fundamentals? All right, the next slide is an eye chart. Don't worry about this. This is actually findable else in many different ways. We have conformance resources for all of MHD, which is all that this page is showing you. And if you go into Simplifier and look for IHE MHD, you will find these. If you go to the FHIR registry, you will find these. If you go to the FHIR implementation guide registry, you will find all of the IHE profiles, including MHD. And if you still can't figure it out, I can help you. But all the conformance resources are there. I've gone through a couple of FHIR Connectathons with these, where they beat on me mercilessly, so I'm pretty confident of them. But now it gets to this question of why would I be a JSON-based application and be willing to receive CDA XML? Now, so this is kind of saying, great, this MHD kind of puts me only halfway. Maybe the responder will convert it to a FHIR document if it's convertible, but I actually don't even want a document because I really just want to know what is the current medications this patient is on, right? So in some regards, MHD has answered some of the problem, but it hasn't answered all of the problem. It answered the problem it was originally asked to do, which was, hey, how do I get at the metadata without going through SOAP transactions? So what I'm going to go into next is, hey, we looked at this too. 5 minutes, great. So query for existing data is a profile that the PCC domain produced, and it essentially, as I said in the last hour, essentially it has, in an international specification, created a profile which is just the subset of the most interesting FHIR resources, very much taking inspiration from Argonaut, very much taking inspiration from the various country cores like US core, Netherlands core. So this is, QED is essentially the equivalent of Argonaut, if you will, or US core. It's all it is saying these are a good subset to start with. It really hasn't constrained them in any way, except to say these are a fantastic subset, and it created some groupings, some named options so that somebody can say, hey, I implemented the medication subset. With one exception in that it did define the use of provenance, whereas Argonaut and US core have no mention of provenance. We use provenance in the next couple of steps. QED stands on its own if you are some kind of a data source. So if you're an EHR and you can publish this stuff like Argonaut does, great. QED, could be something you can declare. But now we go back to this document sharing environment. So I have a bunch of documents, and I want to be able to get access to them at the FHIR observation level or the FHIR medication level. So what this profile, the Mobile Cross-Enterprise Document Data Element Extraction profile did was it said, hey, if you've got a set of documents, there could be an agent that is extracting all of the data out of those documents and making them available through QED so that I now have observations So I have a stack of observations, I have a stack of allergies, and I've brought them all together so that I don't have duplicates, I don't have bad data, if you will. What this said, though, is there is a need, if I'm looking at an allergy, to be able to say, okay, I'm about to write a new diagnostic report, and I'm going to leverage that I saw that this allergy was there, and that's why I canceled this, prescription. But I need to know the provenance of that allergy. I can use the FHIR provenance resource to go all the way back to the documents that it came from. So what this is showing is, this is the XDS environment. Got a bunch of, these guys are publishing documents, medical summaries, episodes, discharge summaries, etc. I've got over here a FHIR app that wants observations, medications, allergies, doesn't want documents, it wants those things. So I have some engine that's pulling all of these observations out, but he's also creating a provenance so that if I'm looking at, medication 2, I can look, what's the provenance of medication 2? And I can see this came from exactly one document. It was patient authored. Yeah, okay, I'm not going to trust it too much. Versus this other medication that is indicated as part of a care plan, and there's evidence that the patient is compliant. So I can now see why documents are important to understand the context of where that piece of information came from. When I'm looking at a data element, I can see the provenance to that context. So I have this nice circle. But I've decomposed them out of the documents so that I don't have to deal with documents. But when I need to use it, when I need to confirm where did this come from, I have the provenance back to where did this come from. Does that make sense? As I'm trying to throw this quick into the last minute at the end of the day. So the provenance resource is kind of described here. I'm actually the owner of the provenance resource in FHIR. So this is second nature to me. But a provenance resource is intended where explicit provenance is intended, is needed. Most of the resources within FHIR, like observation, already in itself explains who wrote this observation. So provenance isn't natively necessary for all resources. But when you have a use case like this, it becomes very useful to be able to actually track through the provenance of where did this come from and by what way did it come. So in this case, the model is for every document that you decomposed, you'll have one provenance resource. That provenance resource you'll explain, when did you decompose it? The policy, we have a fixed policy to talk about this QEDM thing. The agent, the provenance agent, is that software that did the decomposition. Maybe a human intervened, who knows? You could do that too. And then the entity in the provenance is the document reference from which this came from. And then the target is all of the resources that you decomposed out of this document. Okay? Which means if I have an observation that came from one document, it'll have one provenance resource pointing at it. But if I have an observation that was found in 10 documents, it'll have 10 provenance resources pointing at it. So the more provenance resources pointing at it, the stronger you can believe that particular observation. Does that make sense? So we're to the conclusion. So document metadata query, publication of documents. So you do have this FHIR-based way to publish documents, to find documents, but you've also got some decomposition mechanisms, and you can use provenance to get back to the original document. Any questions? PDQM is just an API. If you want to deploy it across the nation, you could. So it's not, when you get into the FHIR ones, there really isn't yet a model for when is something local and when is something national or beyond national, because there isn't yet discussions around federation of FHIR queries. So they're all local. It's just your definition of local could be nation. But in this case, you know, more than likely, if you've got an XDS environment or even an XCA environment, you'll probably only stand up one of these decomposers. And hopefully you stand it up as a lazy decomposer so that it's basically when somebody triggers a query to QED, you go, oh shoot, I don't have the documents on this guy. So I'll go out and get them, prioritize the decomposition and start building up, rather than decomposing, you know, every time somebody publishes. But either model is possible. That's software design, not interoperability spec.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.